Yeah guys, currently I'm working at Leeds Met as a lecturer there in sports coaching degree. Previously I worked at Kvein Tigers as a S&C coach with junior squads and first team. Used to run Ryan through a few drills there, didn't I? I sort of moved on from Cashford and now do alongside Leeds Met, do a little bit with Bradford Bulls and a bit of stuff with the RFL and consulting there. So Mark asked me to present. He asked me to just basically present on in terms of my research. So I started putting the presentation together and thought I'd try and make it a little bit more applicable and practical applications of it really. So I sort of came up with making the most of your fitness testing as an area how maybe as coaches you could potentially use your data better and to enhance the coaches and players that you're working with. So within that I'll try and include some of my research and provide some implications from that as well. So hopefully this works well. My clicker isn't working on the laptop, so the slides won't work as well as I want to do. Okay, so first of all, fitness testing as S&C coaches. I'm sure we've all done fitness testing on a variety of different things. So body composition testing, speed testing there, endurance testing through yo-yo, strength testing in the gym. So fitness testing is a big part of what we do as strength and conditioning coaches. Okay, but why do we do this test? What are the purpose behind testing as players and using fitness testing? So these are a number of reasons why we do that. So to establish some norms, a talent identification perspective on what are we looking for in the players and where should they be. Assessing players' strengths and weaknesses, which will then help us monitor their progress and also prescribe some training, ultimately prescribe training programs in terms of what we're doing. Okay. We're also looking at providing feedback to coaches and players in terms of where they currently are. And I think that forms a part of an education process in working with the coaches and the athletes that we're working with. And then also we can use fitness testing, and probably this is where it's maybe moving a little bit now in terms of monitoring readiness to train and play, etc. So there's some of the reasons why we could potentially fitness test. Okay. There's a recent paper just been published by David Pine from the Australian Institute of Sport. And they basically, him and a couple of other guys, have done a review on the use of fitness testing. And at the end, they sort of say that the challenge for strength and conditioning coaches is basically to effectively use the fitness testing data to inform the prescription of training and inform players and coaches of their needs. Okay, so to me, although we've got all these reasons why we test, whether we coaches do that effectively, I think is a question that could be asked, and whether if there's techniques out there that we can use that more effectively, I think is important to ultimately prescribe training better and inform and work with coaches and players in terms of getting them to buy into that and develop what they need to do. So I think that's a challenge really, and I think hopefully that's where some of my research fits into that. So in relation to these things and the quote there, so talent ID, assessing players' strengths and weaknesses, monitoring progress, prescribing training and educating coaches and athletes, the first thing that we need to do is establish some norms, okay? And that is what some research studies out there try and do, and I guess as coaches you will collect your data and use that in terms of the norms that you're comparing players against, etc. So that sort of takes me on to really, a study I've recently done in academy rugby league players, which was about establishing norms of those players. So we looked at recently published in Journal Strength Conditioning Coach conditioning research about anthropometric and physical characteristics of academy rugby league players. So this study looked at 257 players over a 6-year period between under 16s and under 20s, and then we split that down backs and forwards. They were the measures, anthropometric and physical measures as well. So 10 and 20 metre sprint, vertical jump, yo-yo recovery test level 1, and then 1RM and relative back squat, bench press and prone no. So really just to establish what are these rugby league players between 16 and 20 years of age able to achieve on those tests. So obviously when this is presented in research papers, there's quite a lot of data there, a lot of numbers, in terms of mean and standard deviation. So that is information by age category, that increases, and then broken down by position as well in terms of backs and forwards. So there's a lot of data that's being presented there to establish these norms of the players, but also there's some key findings within the research that can be used to prescribe training and hence findings. Okay. So really the key findings from this paper were, first of all, comparative data for academy rugby league players between 16 and 20 years by backs and forwards positions. Okay. What we saw across the age categories was a height increase between 16 and 20s, body mass increased, vertical jump performance increase and strength increase. So as we'd expect, those characteristics are improving with age between 16 and 20 years of age. However, what we didn't see any change not change, but any difference between the age categories was in relation to summer force skin folds, body composition, speed, 10 metres, 20 metre speed didn't differ between the age categories, and estimated VO2 max versus yo-yo test. So there we can already start to distinguish some characteristics that may differ between the age categories that we're working with over that time. When we look at the differences between backs and forwards, as we'd imagine, forwards are tall and heavy, so they're bigger playing position, and they have greater 1RMs, so greater absolute strength. But then in terms of the backs, they're leaner, quicker, more powerful from the vertical jump perspective, with greater relative strength on those lifts again. So again, identifying which possibly could be used from a talent ID perspective in terms of what we'd be looking for in terms of classifying position and the positions that we're working with. So there are some general findings which quite obvious what we'd expect to see with age. Maybe we'd expect to see some changes in speed and VO2 max. So implication for practice, first of all. So I think that even though there's no change in speed and VO2 max, one important implication for practice is that we're not just considering their result in a 20 metre sprint, but we're also looking to combine anthropometric and fitness characteristics together. Okay, and that's maybe where the difference in progression will come in relation to age. So if we take momentum for instance, which is probably an important characteristic for rugby league, where we need to consider their size and their speed together, maybe these are some of the characteristics that need to be reported and need to be considered in the testing that we do as coaches. Okay, so this isn't published. This was shown in a poster we did at a Bases conference. So basically we looked at momentum, 10 and 20 metres, and then peak power by basically looking at body mass in relation to the sprint and vertical jump performance. So then when we look at these over the age categories, we actually see an improvement in those things. So even though there's no difference in speed between under 16s and under 20s age category, when we consider body mass in relation to that, that's going to be an important factor. So making sure that we consider that in relation to the assessment of the players that we're doing. So maybe assessing some different things in relation to momentum, peak power, etc. Which, in terms of the research in rugby league, and I don't know about rugby union, but as far as I'm aware, there's not probably much. That's things that need to be considered moving forward. I think Dan Baker's done a little bit of it in rugby league and the importance of it there. And again, maybe it needs to be used from a coaching perspective. Okay. Some other implications. So relative strength increase with age as well. So although we'd expect to see absolute strength increases, we see some relative strength increases as well. So the strength's increasing above that of the body mass, alright, which through periodised strength training we'd expect to see that, okay? And then this was also the first study that looked at pulling strength data in relation to rugby players. And I think in terms of the research, there's a bit of a limited, although as coaches we've probably got more of an understanding of that. In the research, I think there's limited research out there and the understanding of it. And when we looked at the pushing to pulling ratio within these players, that was between 105% up to 116% under 19s. So in some of the research, it suggested that should be below 100%. With more of a focus on pulling-based programs. So I imagine that most people do focus on pulling over pushing in their programs, but again, providing some evidence to support that, I think, is necessary moving forward. And a bit of data, hopefully, I'll provide later, will show the importance of that. So again, some implications of study that can be applied into practice in relation to that. So this was one of the, this is in the practical implications section of the paper, so I've written this. So it says, it is recommended that such data should be used by strength and conditioning coaches and player development staff for player identification, assessing individual player strengths and weaknesses, and monitoring player development. So when after I read that again, and that came up with really two questions for me in relation to what I wrote, and how easy is that for coaches to actually do that. So the first question was, do coaches, and I'll ask this to you guys, do coaches use research findings and research data to do those things in relation to testing?
I mean, S&C coaches.
S&C coaches, yeah. So do you use data in the research, or have you established your own data set for making comparisons against? The latter, so your own data set, Brendan, yeah? Yeah, to a degree? Bit of both? Okay, well that's good. That's my first question was, I know I do it in my practice, but whether other coaches do that, and whether, am I just presenting that data just to get a research publication, or is it actually having an effect on what coaches may do? I think it's an important question for me from a researcher as well, to know whether that data is informing practice. Okay. The second question then related on to how do coaches use this data, or use their fitness testing data. Okay, and then I'll put that in relation to providing feedback. So providing feedback to the players that you're working with and the coaches. And again, that's probably something that I think I've only probably started to do and think about more recently, is we collect all this data, fitness testing data, but how do we actually use it compared with the literature or your own data sets to then provide feedback to the players that we're working with and the coaches that are working with those players as well. So I think it's an important question, and maybe in my sort of statement there, I'm assuming that coaches know how to do that, but maybe the next step is how, do coaches know how to do that effectively? So this is a paper that I did the last study from a PhD, which basically looked at an individualised approach to monitoring growth and fitness in junior rugby league players, so between 13 and 15. Now, that's a radar graph that basically allows data to be presented from means and standard deviations using the Z-score. So we could potentially go to the research literature, look at the data that's in there, and then compare somebody's performance against that data using the Z-scores of the 0, the dark line being the mean, and then +, -1, +, -2 being the number of standard deviations away from the mean. So if the mean was, for say, vertical jump was 50 centimetres, standard deviation of 5, if someone was scoring 60 centimetres, they'd normally be scoring around the 2 mark. So obviously good for their point. Okay, so that is potentially an approach that could be used as your own data sets or research evidence to present findings and present data back to your players and coaches. So this is the data from the study, and basically we looked at 3 junior players of differing positions and different maturation levels. So as you can see, player 1 there is quite close, is below average on a number of variables, whereas player 3 at the under 13 age category is around the average mark, around the 0 mark. As we then monitor their development over time, we see some differing trajectories occurring. Okay, so player 1 and player 2 have improved quite a lot over that 2-year period, whereas player 3 has only improved in certain variables. So this, I know I'm presenting this data here, it's as a way of actually looking at using it as a technique to monitor players' development and change over time against a standard set of scores. Now, there's probably quite a lot, you could all quite critical of this method and say that it's not considering age or it's not considering playing position and things like that, and I appreciate any feedback that you've got. But I think as a tool in terms of comparing players from a research perspective, it is quite useful to then say where players are in relation to the standards. So that's the research in relation to it anyway. They're just some of the scores that change. So basically, from a practical perspective, what that allows us to do and use the data is try and create some standards for the players, which I'm sure we've got. So from the research data and pulling my own ideas as well, to come up, so away from the 0 to 2 or -2 aspect, we then can score players on a 1 to 5 basis, based on these standards and of the means and standard deviations of that data. So there are some tests that we could that I use, and the standards for those within an academy squad. That then feeds into play reporting, and there's some example play reports that we use with the coaches and the players to identify where people are, players are currently at, and then also prescribe their training programs in relation to where their strengths and weaknesses lie. Now, I've used this for a couple of years, this approach, and I'm not. I think it's good for the coaches and the strength and conditioning coaches in that we can identify where we're strong and where people currently are. But I think when I'm presenting this to players, it can maybe sometimes be a little bit confusing for them, and even a little bit complicated, and they may not get out of it what they necessarily need. So I've sort of started working on developing a bit of a scoring system, really, to provide an overall score. So, and this is working with the club at Bradford. Their aim is to try to develop a club-wide scoring system of their physical development. We're looking at developing an overall scoring of their full rugby league performance as well, but physical development is probably the easiest place to start. So we're looking at developing a club-wide system for doing that. Okay, and they're the reasons to do that. So simplify some feedback that we're giving to the players and coaches. Take into account overall physical development. So, we can look at these separate measures, but how can we package all that together to say who is the best athlete, and then also monitor progressions with age in relation to where we are. So basically, the technique I've used is from using those standards, so the mean and standard deviations, to create a 1 to 5 scoring system, and then they will get an average score for each of those measures. So for speed, strength, power, agility, aerobic/anaerobic capacity. So if they've got 3 strength measures, okay, they may score a 4 for bench press, 3 for squat, and 2 for pulling exercise. So that will give them an average of 3 in relation to their overall strength, and then it'll give us an overall average in relation to their scoring. Then what I do, due to the importance of size or mass for rugby and its relationship, what I showed before in relation to momentum, we then multiply that by lean body mass. So we calculate lean body mass by taking the body composition, the body fat out of there. Obviously we want muscle mass, not fat mass. So that's an example there of a bull rating. The average for each of the sections there, which when multiplied by their lean mass will give them an overall score and what we're terming at the minute as a bull rating, basically. So that will then allow easy comparison for players and for coaches as well to show where they are in relation to their overall physical development. Now, as I say, this is again work in progress. That data is based on mainly the scholarship players, and we're looking at developing the same throughout the first team players to then really have a list of how many players at the club, probably about 80, 90 players, to really give them a bit of a list in terms of where they are physically, and show that even though some of the younger players can score good at speed, vertical jump, aerobic capacity tests, without that lean body mass and an overall score, that they may not be able to progress onto the next level, really. So again, any feedback or any thoughts on that would be appreciated. I'm just really suggesting what we're doing and how we're trying to simplify things and make things practical based on both the research and practical application. How am I doing this time, man?
Couple of minutes.
Okay. So that is really using the data. The next bit I want to go on to was how do we monitor progress really. Okay, so although we can compare data with established norms through the research or your own data set, this is mostly of a cross-sectional nature. So the radars I showed before show progression over a number of years. So, but what are the expected improvements that we'd expect, you know, following a program? So that's a 4-week program, a 6-month program, a yearly program. What are the long-term expected changes that we're expecting to occur in players related to those why we fitness test again? So, establishing longitudinal data that establishes change over time is really, you know, I think the next step to allow us to see how players should be progressing over time. So. This is a study that, again, for general strength conditioning research that's currently in review, again, can be critiqued quite strongly. We've just looked initially based on the data that was available, pre to post season changes, so first, you know, initial testing at pre-season and then their end of season testing, and looking at the changes that are occurring there. We've also got some data that will look at more longitudinal changes from year to year and over a 5-year period. What percentage of players are improving from an under 15 player to an under 20 player, and the expected changes that can occur long term. So that's some of the data in relation to that. Again, just some key findings from a practical point of view. So younger players, in this probably related to the programme as well, younger players, greater seasonal improvements in body mass and vertical jump performance. Older players, greater seasonal improvements in speed and estimated VO2 max. All players, significant reduction in body comp, and under 18s had greater strength improvement than the under 20s in terms of percentages. Okay, so implications. So large individual variation in the changes that are occurring. So again, that suggests to me that it's important to monitor players on an individual basis and look at individuals on a case-by-case basis instead of a team basis. Again, as I suggested before, monitor relative changes in terms of speed and aerobic capacity, so looking at momentum, etc. And these findings suggest that with the 3 pre-season and 2 in-season weight training sessions a week, that elicited strength improvements over the season in junior rugby players. And then the last one, which I think, and back to my pro and row example before, we then looked at the relationship between the change in performance of each variable with each variable. And I'm just going to present the pro and row data here, but the relationships basically show that pro and row was the variable that was most significantly related to any of the other variables there. Okay, so that's then started to indicate a very significant change. So it's basically saying big improvements in pro and row, or the data suggesting that improvements in pro and row pulling strength will result in improvements in speed, vertical jump, yo-yo performance and strength in other variables. So for me that's suggesting that pro and row and pulling strength is probably, again, further evidence that that's maybe definitely a priority in programs and maybe a good measure of athletic performance as well. So that, to suggest we need to be looking at changes in performance. So last couple of slides were, where's the research application going in terms of fitness testing? I think there's a great need for understanding of expected changes of short and longer term programs. So more, what are the expected changes that we'd expect to see? I think then there's room, and this is probably electronic zone, but fitness testing versus daily monitoring. So how can we use fitness testing within, some of you guys probably do, in terms of daily monitoring, or the sessions that you're doing, does that then become part of the fitness testing that you do? So there's not a specific fitness test, but every session is a fitness testing session. And then the last one is, obviously well-being measures are used quite comprehensively now in sport, but as far as I'm aware from a research perspective, there's none that really consider that in relation to the fitness testing results, and now that could have an effect on the results there. So hopefully I've got you thinking about how you can potentially make the most of your fitness testing, and if you any questions or want any of the papers that I've suggested today, just drop us an email or call or whatever, and I'll send them over to you, and hopefully that was useful. So, any questions?
Any questions for Kvein Till?
The bull rate,
Yeah.
do you give like a weighting for the larger, I might have missed it, but do you give like a weighting for
So,
like your forwards that are...
So the way I've considered that is by giving their scores and then multiplying it by their league body mass. So the bigger guys will potentially score lower on the fitness measures, so with that lower average score, that will bump their score up. So obviously, because mass is needed for rugby, that's where, as I say, I've only sort of worked on it the last couple of weeks, and I need to probably look at the data throughout the club really. But I think it should work.
Yeah, the numbers with the ball rating fluctuate. Do you have any players that maintain the same mass but score higher? Is that reflected in the outcome number? Or if they lost a bit of body fat but got stronger?
So at the minute, the bull rating is just, I haven't looked at changing that performance. That's just based on the pre-season testing data that we've got at the club at the minute. So I don't know if you can, so here we've got somebody, player 9, 3.23 is quite lower than 3.1, you know, the rating there. So obviously he's the 3.13 guy is a bigger guy, so that's why he's scoring greater. But whether those changes would reflect in either performance or maths. That's why I tried to develop it, is that so it's something that takes into account both things, which I don't think I haven't probably considered as much before, and I don't think as many people consider that in practice. So, I may be wrong.
Once you get the rating, you look a bit more in depth, so they might have scored really high on 2 of the strength tests, but not one of the others.
Yeah, I think the stuff that I presented before in terms of the graphs, as an example, that's where the S&C coach would look at that in more detail and say that this is where he's strong, this is where he's weak, this is maybe how his programme needs to be determined. The bull rating is probably more as a feedback mechanism for the players and the coaches to buy into, this is where I am. This is for an under 15 player, but this player in my position, this is his rating. So even though we may be suggesting on some of these that his speed's quite good and his vertical jump performance is good, it's really then taking into account that he needs to get some lead mass gains as well. So as I said, that's work in progress really. I just wanted to get some ideas.
Okay, thanks Kvein, thanks for your time and